Continuing with the study of the institution that did not consolidate it, third part, it corresponds to continuing the approach of the theme. And because we have been using the adequate tools of the scriptures, now we need to bring a text that we can analyze, not profoundly as we will want, because it's not that subject, even though we will consider if in the future we can do a series of studies where we can do an approach of each of the passages, not of the scriptures because we will never end, but of some that present some series of inconsistencies or contradictions for some and for others. We bring to be used as a pyramidal base the passage that is found in Daniel chapter 2 verse 32 to 33 that establishes the following. This image's head was of fine gold, his breast and his arms of silver, his belly and his thighs of brass, his legs of iron, his feet part of iron and part of clay. Look what an extraordinary passage this is. This one is one of the passages that has had a lot of controversy. Moreover, it has been criticized because it has even been tried to disavow it. There is a whole history in this that someday we will try to tell so that you can enrich your knowledge or your cultural and scriptural heritage in relation with this passage of Daniel. Because if you didn't know, the book of Daniel has been one of the books that has been questioned, criticized, and even has been tried to deprive it of its authority for a series of elements, a series of circumstances. Moreover, there are like this one also countless of texts that there are people that have tried to deprive them of their authority and that have been questioned because there are many people that criticize it, that believe that it is not true, as simple as that. And this happens because nowadays there are many people that do not agree with it, because they do not believe what the scriptures teach or reveal as true. And as we said before, we will look for a moment so that we can analyze all the background that has been generated in relation with this text of Daniel, and share with you the different critics and adverse commentaries, and maybe if time reaches, we can even share from other texts that have also been strongly questioned by some authors of some books, which we consider should be brought to the public forum, and hence investigated, studied, and analyzed. But well, this gift that God gives us through the prophet Daniel about a structuring of the kingdoms of the world that belong to another epoch, another era, it calls our attention very powerfully. Those who have studied the topic of the dispensations know that there is a dispensation that addressed in a very interesting way this topic of the composition of the governments of the world. It is important to know this composition because in some way it shows the will and criteria of God. That is the fundamental one, is the most important of all. All other criteria involving ours falls behind, is left behind, has no value. God speaks and we don't want anyone else to speak because God has already spoken, and for the Church of God it is the most important. So in this narrative, as we repeat, we will not dwell much, not because we wouldn't want, we will be very interested in saying to you, well, we will depart in this moment from the study of the institution that did not consolidate it, and we will study prophecy, but it's not correct, right? Remember that God is a God of order, so we are also obliged to respect that order. So in Daniel chapter 2 verse 32 to 33, something extraordinary is being told. It tells us how God looks through the centuries and the years, which will be the structure, define, and envision composition of the governments of the world. And look what an interesting thing. The beginning of these governments, in other words, from where God shares his point of view or vision, he considers that the beginnings of these governments are very glorious beginnings, even though the term is inappropriate. The truth is that it is being talked about fine gold, and the sense of the fine gold has various senses, but in this particular case, the head, by having that precious metal of the fine gold, speaks of something very interesting, and it speaks of its value. It speaks of its beauty, it speaks of its weight and its appreciation and its quality as a government. It is possible that historians won't have the reach and won't say to us and won't share this vision that God shares in this vision of the head being of fine gold. But here it comes the interesting part. As time goes by, or new governments are being born or being replaced, we cannot deny the pass of time. And after the head being of fine gold, it begins its degradation, because Daniel tells us that the breast and its arms were now of silver. The silver, in a determined point, is something very precious. In that time it was something very appreciated, one of the most valuable metals, but had less value than gold. Gold is an extraordinary thing, to such a point that gold in a determined moment became the trust, the confidence that there was in the payment system. Nowadays this has been abandoned. That should be another history that also we will have to tell. But for aspects of this study of the institution that did not consolidate it, part 3, what we will have to say is that the governments that were coming behind that head of fine gold were governments that were losing quality in substance and in appearance, because we cannot say that silver, which is shining and beautiful, but is not as gold. And after this government, there is a big degradation, even though the burnished brass is seen as a very interesting, is not appreciated material. And after these governments, others appeared. And Daniel tells us that the belly and the thighs were of brass. From gold to brass there is a big degradation, even though the burnished brass is seen as very interesting. It's not a very appreciated material. Yes, it was a material that was much used in those days, but it's not an appreciated material. So it doesn't have the characteristics of the gold, much less of the silver. But it tells us how the government or the governments that had those characteristics were degrading. And if it wasn't already enough, Daniel ended up telling us that the legs were of iron, iron is a material much less appreciated regarding its value. That means that the elements have degraded so much that we are arriving to the extremes. As well as fine gold is an extreme because there exists also gold, but the fine gold is of better quality, and depending its carats, the same way we had the iron. The iron is one of the metals less appreciated, but if that was not all, Daniel ends up telling us that the feet of that statue, of that image, were in part of iron and in part of clay. So imagine yourself what a vision this one, what composition of elements, to what point this matter extends, that these elements only say to us that these governments have come from the best to the worst. We would like to address it from a different perspective, but for aspects of the study, we have to leave it here, because it's not the idea to enter in a study of the prophecy. For the Church of God, it's important to transmit the knowledge, and it does it in the possible ways. That is why we have put in your disposition a web page. Its address is churchofgod.tk. There you can interact with the web page. There are some resources, some studies, some teachings, and you can ask some study by email. We will gladly send it. Also, the Church of God has put in your disposition an email, which is the last church 7 in number, okay? gmail.com. There you can write to us, express your concerns, your questions, your doubts, your commentaries, your debates, and if you consider it to be convenient, we will answer you. We hope that this study, the same as the ones that will keep coming, serves to enrich your knowledge in the Word of God. Thank you.